Welcome to episode 4 of QUILTSIDE Chats. Brought to you by the American Quilt Study Group. The American Quilt Study Group establishes and promotes the highest standards for interdisciplinary quilt-related studies, providing opportunities for study, research, and the publication of works that advance the knowledge of quilts and related subjects. In partnership with the International Quilt Museum. The International Quilt Museum's mission is to build a global collection and audience that celebrate the cultural and artistic significance of quilts. Sponsored by Quilt Folk, a quarterly keepsake magazine of, by, and for quilters. QUILTSIDE Chats are a series of lively conversations between Carolyn Ducey, International Quilt Museum Curator of Collections, and an American Quilt Study Group member featuring the quilt that she or he would sneak out of the building if it weren't a crime. Sue Reich is the author of many books on quilt history, including World War II quilts. Among her numerous projects and publications, she was an instrumental contributor to the Connecticut Quilt Search Project, which culminated in the book Quilts and Quilt Makers Covering Connecticut. She is a past president of AQSG and currently serves on the board of Quilts of Valor. You can learn more about her and purchase her books on her website at www.coveringquilthistory.com. Carolyn Ducey is Curator of Collections at the International Quilt Museum, a position she has held since 1998. She oversees acquisition and management of the IQM collection of more than 8,500 quilts. Ducey earned an MA in American Art History from Indiana University in 1998 and her PhD in Textiles, Clothing, and Design with an emphasis in quilt studies at the University of Nebraska in 2010. She is co-editor of American Quilts in the Industrial Age, 1760 to 1870, published in 2018, and a co-author of What's in a Name? Inscribed Quilts, published in 2012. And now, let's cozy up to the quilt.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're so happy that you joined us today, and I'm so thrilled to have Sue Reich with us. Sue picked out a terrific quilt, and gosh, Sue, you have such an amazing knowledge of quilts and wonderful research and publications. So I just know we're going to learn a lot of really great things today. So tell us why you picked this particular quilt too, if you could steal one from the museum.
Well, thank you, Carolyn, for inviting me to participate in this. And today I chose the Old Glory quilt that's in your exhibit, that's in the museum. It was made by a quilt maker named Mary Erckenbrack. And I chose this quilt because unlike the state flower quilts and the state bird quilts, this is a state nickname quilt. So it's very unique. And Mary designed this using her amazing artistic ability. So I thought it would be fun. And I've actually only ever seen 2 others made. One is owned by Lynn Evans Miller, and the other is a quilt in my collection, but not as in good shape as this one is.
Well, and this is such an interesting quilt because Mary is so fascinating, and you were able to do a lot of research about her and her artistic career. So tell us all about Mary.
Yes, she really is. And it's so neat to be able to find the bio of the quilt designer, because I feel like I'm putting the 2 pieces of the puzzle together and making it whole. So Mary, this is a wonderful picture of Mary, and she was known for her artistic ability in ceramics, pottery, sculpture. Oops, go back one. Thank you. A muralist and also a quilt designer. She was actually a native of Seattle, And she had a very interesting childhood. Her father was a shipping commissioner, and they moved around the world. She lived in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, London, Paris, and also Seattle, where she went to the University of Washington, and she trained in architecture and medical illustration. So she used all of her experience, I think, in traveling the world, and then her creative talents that you'll then be able to see in her artwork and in the quilts that she designed.
So interesting to see an artist who's designing some quilts. But let's you've got some other images of her sculpture and painting. Let's take a look at those, because we do kind of see relationships between her art, her pottery, and her other artwork in the quilt blocks as well.
So Mary was very prolific, and the sculpture that you see here, that you saw there, it was on eBay, and if at the bottom of the statue is her signature, and it just says Mary E. So her sculptures and her ceramics were sold all over the United States. So you may be lucky enough to be able to find a piece of hers if you're so inclined. But this is one example. And then as we move on, this is another example of one of her sculptures. And then her ceramics with the images of the very flowy women, and then the men. And I think that that dish on the right has something to do with the WPA, although there was no real text with that image. She was also a WPA artist. So I thought that was very interesting to add to her bio.
And I think these, like you said, those flowy lines really we'll really see those in the quilt blocks when we get to those.
Right, yeah. She was also a painter, and so this is an example of one of her paintings. And then this is one of the places that she exhibited. And those of you who lived in California in the San Francisco area probably were familiar with the City of Paris galleries. This is one of the galleries that she exhibited with in San Francisco. She also operated her own shop called Mary E's Mud Shop on Clay Street in San Francisco. And she sold her creations through a department store named Gumps, Vic Morris, Marshall Fields, and specialty shops in New York. Her studio was on Telegraph Hill, and this is a photograph from a newspaper from 1957 of Mary in her studio at the kiln. And then this is an example of one of her sculptures, and she had sculptures all over San Francisco. Most of them were outdoors, some of them were indoors. Mary was very giving and very benevolent. She worked to help raise money for Catholic organizations, for the Children's Hospital in San Francisco, for Jewish organizations. And she was also very active in the street fairs in her area. I believe that this is a picture of some of the street fairs that she was featured as supporting. And then, as I said, the Shriners Children's Hospital, her famous Chinese food dogs guarded the gateways, to Chinatown, were also replicated for statues that appeared, or sculptures that appeared at the Children's Hospital. So she was actually very supportive of a lot of organizations and a lot of important hospitals and Catholic, whether it was Catholic or Jewish. She was very ecumenical.
And she was really very successful at a time when there were not maybe a lot of women that were having that kind of artistic success.
I can't speak to that, but I think maybe in the California area it was a little different than in other parts of the country. She was one of a number of artists that were invited to the IBM Corporation in San Jose, California, to display her sculpture also.
Wow.
Which is kind of neat.
It's very neat. She is really amazing. And we don't really know, obviously, when she was designing the quilt, she designed 2 that we're aware of. She was very young. If she was born in, was it 1910 or 1911, then she was only in her 20s then when she was doing the designs for the quilt. So maybe something early on where she was just experimenting or trying to find ways to support herself.
So she started to do her quilt designs in the 1930s, and she has 2 quilts that she designed. One is what is called the Golden West quilt. Now, I don't have an image of that as completed, but this was the diagram that was in a newspaper, and it was published in the Herald Journal of Logan, Utah, and beginning in 1932. That was in the month of January. And they would probably publish a block a week. And here are some of the blocks that were featured in that newspaper. And you can see her flowy images. I'm not sure. I think these would be probably better to embroider than to applique. But the Golden West quilt was described as 6 feet long by 5 feet wide, with a 3-inch border at the ends and 9 inches at the side. And so the total width would have been 5.5 feet long by 3.5 feet wide. So her quilts are quite large. But then again, you need blocks that are large to be able to get this detail in the embroidery work.
And these are about 6-inch blocks? Is that?
Oh, I think so. I never saw a block size. Let me see. The entire quilt is made up of 6-inch squares, yes.
Yeah, when we got the Old Glory quilt, both Zania Cord and Mary Kay Wavogel, 2 of our most esteemed AQSG members, both kind of helped us to figure out what it is we were seeing. We were really intrigued with the quilt. We have a very strong kit or pattern collection, so we were intrigued by this, and they helped get us that information. And so Mary Kay even had some of the original blocks that came out of the newspaper, the patterns for them for the Old Glory.
So this is the Old Glory quilt, and in the center of that quilt is the torch of the Statue of Liberty raised, which is very neat. And then the stars don't have any specific significance, but the pattern I found was published in the Mercury, Pottstown, Pennsylvania, in 1932 and 1933. And these are some examples of what it looked like. There's a finished one on the right, and then they actually had a competition in Pennsylvania to see, and they had an exhibit of the quilts. Now, I couldn't find any photographs or any other documentation of the exhibit, but there were prizes that were given out for the winning quilt that was made from Mary's patterns.
Well, and we found some information that the patterns had also been published in the Spokane newspaper and in the Omaha World Herald. So there was a Nebraska connection to this quilt as well, or at least to the pattern. As you said, there's only a few of these quilts that are out there, and ours does not have any attribution with it, so we don't know who made it.
So the one I have does not have attribution either. I'm not sure about Lynn's, but and they weren't, the quilt wasn't widely published, but it was published. So so it's nice to see that some people did complete the quilt, because it is quite large and there is a lot of embroidery work on it.
There is a lot of embroidery work to it, a lot of layers of work to this piece. But well, let's take a look at it in some more detail.
So this is one of the blocks. I picked out about 6 blocks that I thought were interesting. I love this one. This is the New Mexico block. Now, New Mexico's nickname is the Spanish state. And so this was the way she wanted to render that. And if you take a look at where it's placed on the quilt, and Tara's just doing a great job finding all those blocks for us. But there she is, the señorita, and that represents New Mexico. And you can see the resemblance of the drawing for the young lady on the quilt block and some of her sculpture and some of her ceramics. I think there's definitely a resemblance there.
Definitely.
And a similarity. The next block we have is New Jersey, and New Jersey is the Garden State. So that would be the block for the Garden State. And here we have that right below New Mexico. So all these were on the quilt in alphabetical order. And there is the New Jersey block. I tried to be fair and balanced and pick out states across the US instead of focusing on one area. But and then our next block is Ohio. This is the Buckeye State. So that is the pattern for the Buckeye block, or the Ohio Buckeye block. And here we go.
And can we point, as we're looking right there, close to the Ohio block, and we'll go back to your other blocks, but one of the interesting things about our quilt is that the Texas block is upside down. So if you see it right there, just kind of at a diagonal from Ohio, there it is. And it's the Texas star, but we have no idea why that one is upside down, and may not be so on the other 2 quilts that exist. I wonder if we can find out from Lynn if that's the case with hers. But you didn't think it was upside down on your example, did you, Sue?
So you know what? I'll go back and look. I have a high resolution image of it, so I'll send out a email, or I'll put something on Facebook for the AQSG members so that they'll know whether my block is upside down or not.
I'm so curious what she was trying to say, because Texas upside down, and like you said, it might be that she was trying to say that's where she was from. This maker was from Texas, or who knows? Who knows what she was trying to say to us, but interesting.
And then I think the next block we have is Utah. I thought this was really cool. The Beehive State.
That's such a great block. And there it is.
That's just a great nickname too.
Yes, it is.
And then last, Washington. This is the Evergreen State. So that's great rendition. And that block is
right down there at the bottom. Now, it's so interesting, Sue, that these are the state nicknames, because like you said, we have state flowers and state birds. We have a combination of state flowers and birds. Do you know when those originally came out? Because this seems like it's about the exact same time, but I wonder if she was aware of those others.
So my guess is that she was, and she wanted to be a little bit different. And she had the artistic ability to draw these. Keep in mind, she drew the patterns for the Golden West quilt and the Old Glory quilt at the same, almost at the same exact time, within the same couple of years. So she was very talented. So I think this was probably very easy for her to do, and to give it a try, see if it was lucrative. These are the only 2 quilts that she ever designed, so it's unknown as to why she stopped. Perhaps it wasn't as lucrative as she thought it would be.
So Mary Miller is asking, is the Golden West lost? Do we know if there's a completed Golden West quilt? Have you seen one?
I have never seen one. I did not even know about this quilt until I found it on, in the newspapers, on newspaper.com, and in Genealogy Bank is the other one I do research in. So I think it would be great if everyone would be on the lookout for the Golden West quilt. It's got to be out there somewhere, or maybe some blocks that were never pieced into a quilt, some random blocks. But take a good look at these designs on the museum website, and or if you find something that may fit, take a look at them, because
we may not have it identified, but it may be out there. And Lisa Erlinson said, do you think that the scarcity of a finished quilt is because of the detail in the images?
Well, I think this would definitely be a intricate quilt to embroider, and would be very time consuming. I mean, you're talking about 48 blocks that need to be embroidered, and then all the stars that have to be pieced. So that very well may be the reason.
It's a lot of detail work and a lot of different steps.
But on the other hand, the state flower and the state bird blocks are also very detailed. So I'm not sure why this was not as popular, but it would be fun.
It could simply be because it wasn't in as big as newspapers, like, say, the Kansas City Star. Because you're right, we do see a lot of state flower and state bird blocks. Now, they don't have maybe all the star piecing to do in them and that kind of thing, but maybe it's the availability of the pattern, too, that impacted it.
It's very possible. Yeah, the Pottstown Mercury would, in my mind, not be a main newspaper in Pennsylvania. However, knowing Pennsylvania and the density of quilters in Pennsylvania, it was probably a good choice.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, especially with that, period in between the two world wars. Maybe some people were more intrigued by the patriotic look, and maybe some weren't too, because it's very much a patriotic red, white, and blue quilt. So
keep in mind, in 1932 is when we officially named the Star Spangled Banner as our national anthem, and it is also the 200th anniversary of the birth of George Washington. So there was a lot of patriotic happenings then, and many of the George Washington quilts from the 30s were designed at the same time. So that may be the reason for the patriotic appearance.
Yeah. And Cindy Reynolds says that she thinks that a Golden West quilt was sold many years ago and ended up in California. So all you California members, keep an eye out for that Golden West quilt. Even just to find it in a museum and make sure it's attributed correctly to Mary would be great, because that's what's important, is making sure we get that information all pulled together. Do you have other images of blocks, Sue?
So there's one more, and that is Wisconsin. Oops, I thought, did we do Wisconsin? There we go. Wisconsin is the Badger State. And there you have the badger.
Down in the corner there. Yep.
And there we have, yep. And you can see there is not a lot of quilting on this quilt. But then I always find that embroidered quilts are very hard to design fancy quilt designs around. They're usually very, very simple, maybe outline or maybe straight lines going through, or a grid or something like that, or in the ditch. But you usually do not find fancy quilting on an embroidered quilt like this.
Probably by that time they're ready to be finished with the quilt. All that work.
Exactly. And if you could pull up the center, I think I love the torch design. It seems a little oversized to me for the rest of the quilt, you know, a little out of proportion, but it works, and it's right in the center, so that's good. And then it's interesting that on your quilt, she's got USA on one side in blue and then on the other side in red.
And she's got the S turned around. We've all done that when we've ironed on lettering, that's for sure. Interesting. Lisa asks now, do we know if Mary ever made a quilt? Is there any evidence in her body of work that she worked with textiles at all?
I've never seen anything about her working with textiles. Her mediums were mostly ceramics, sculpture. She had a kiln in her studio. She worked with mud. That she calls her shop Mary E's Mud Shop. So that is what she chose to do for the rest of her life. And I think she was probably very successful. Her wares were sold all over the United States in boutiques in New York, major department stores. So I think she probably was very successful earning a living at what she did.
She found her groove and stuck with that. Well, it's so interesting. We have an exhibition coming up. We're going back to a show that we did many years ago that Maren Hansen researched. It's going to be called, it's going up in October, called Modern Meets Modern. And she talks about the time, the way these kits were supposed to be kind of a modern approach. You know, in the 20th century, a lot of people were looking at how they could modernize quilting. And one of the ways was these kits. And we were talking earlier how they were supposed to be much more simple to make than any other type of quilt. But when you look at Mary's quilt, I don't think that really bears out, does it?
Yeah, and you know, I'm not sure it was actually ever sold as a kit the way you think about a pre-stamped item. I know that her patterns were published, but in the newspapers, but I've never actually seen them available in kit form the way you would see a Paragon quilt, for instance.
Well, even these patterns, you know, you had the one publication that I read about, it was a weekly publication. So it took 4 years for you to get your patterns because they were published from 1932 to 36. And so I imagine you spent all that time in between working on your embroidery and getting your blocks completed and then finally getting your quilt all put together.
What is really interesting about this is when it was published in the Mercury in Pottstown, the ad said it was really simple to make and a 10-year-old girl could make it.
A very skilled 10-year-old girl could make this one, I imagine. No. You know, I love to embroider. I love to embroider, but that's a lot of embroidery work and a lot of detail. As Mary said, the Iowa Hawkeye State block is very detailed. It's just beautiful. And it's just, her designs really do have just a free form to them compared to what we see in other state block or state flowers that are much more kind of standardized in a way. They relate to each other a lot, it seems like.
So I say they're more free-flowing. Some of the state flower and the state bird designs are so exact. This is just sort of, it isn't doodle art, but it is sketch art, kind of sketch art. And I don't know, there's probably a better artistic name for it, but it's very free-flowing and very, you know, you feel like a different kind of artist drew these designs.
Definitely, and they really fill the block where the other patterns seem to be much smaller and contained, in my experience. And did you know I was looking at other state flowers and state birds, and I came across a photo I'd taken about 5 years ago when we were in Australia and traveled for an exhibition there. And one of the things that was so interesting when we were there is that we actually saw that in Australia, a newspaper had produced an Australian state birds pattern. So they had that same kind of a tradition, or they picked up that same idea of publishing a pattern even in Australia. So it was a universal thing.
And I think I know that you've had exhibits on embroidery, but there's so much more research we could do in embroidery. We have textiles, embroidered textiles here in Connecticut that were made for beds and for wear that go back to the 17th and 18th centuries. And I think embroidery is one of those constants that is still very, very popular. And every you think about the crazy quilt embroidery, and then the red work embroidery, and then the signature, the embroidery on the red work, and then the embroidery we see in the state flowers and the state birds, and then it becomes very popular again during the bicentennial, and then after the millennium, red work had a surge again. So embroidery is one of those great constants in quilt making that keep people coming back to handwork. And now we have the machines that will do it for you.
Yeah, you can keep it up. Well, you know what, we've seen a lot of, and it's funny how things will come to us as donation offers. They seem to come in clumps sometimes. We've seen a lot of cross-stitch quilts, which evidently were really popular in the 50s and 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I just can't imagine all those cross-stitch patterns and working on those.
So some of it was called chicken work, wasn't it?
Chicken work? I had not heard that term, but probably. It's just, I really do love the combination of embroidery in the quilting. But I think it's always interesting because a piece like this, if someone used it a lot and washed it, that embroidery stitch doesn't hold up. So this is obviously a piece that, again, you would make this for a very particular kind of a point of view, not really necessarily for something that would use on your bed, more of a statement piece.
Exactly. And then the Patriot Shield, that's a constant. We see that way back in quilts that go back to the Civil War. So you have the Patriot Shield there that she designed, which is great.
Well, it's just so interesting that you could find so much about Mary, and that, like we were talking about earlier, we have some of these people like Marie Webster and Ann Orr that were early designers, and they stayed in the quilt world and published quilt patterns, but that Mary only did a couple of patterns and then went on to almost kind of a different way, an artist who started with quilts but then ended up with her different mediums, whereas some of these other individuals found quilting and really stuck with that. So. And Lisa's asking us about that Texas block. Is that a Union shield? It's actually, I think, a star. It's hard to see because the embroidery is done in a light color, but it's a Texas star with kind of laurel leaves around it. And the whole block is upside down. Well, I assume it's upside down by the way the laurels are placed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, I don't know. I don't know what she's saying about Texas there.
So the star's got to represent the Lone Star State, but then, yeah, it would be interesting. It's sad that we don't have the provenance with it. I'll check my quilt to see if my block's upside down too, or if any of them are.
We're also curious now, see if any other blocks are upside down. Interesting. Well, I asked you, Sue, when we were talking about our program, and we'll certainly take any more questions that you might have on the Old Glory quilt, but we have been so fortunate here at the International Quilt Museum to acquire a couple, well, one has been acquired, one is on its way, collections of Sue's. And I thought it would just be fun while we had Sue to have her just talk a little bit about her World War I and World War II collections. Those are such important collections, Sue, and I just thought it would be great to hear the story about, because it kind of relates to the Old Glory, because you are obviously intrigued with the patriotic quilts or the feeling of patriotism, or what is it about these quilts that drew you to them?
So I've always loved American history, and I feel strongly that if you can give a quilt its provenance, then you have done a great deal for the quilt history world and the quilt world and the American history world and women's history. I think that it's so important. And this is an example. This is a World War I quilt, and this is one of the very reasons why I went on this journey, because this is a Tide Comfort. It's just a variable star, obviously red, white, and blue. But the next slide will show you why. So in one corner, it says April 6, 1917. And the other corner, it says November 11th, 1918. And when I bought that, the owner said, oh, look, this is when she started her quilt in April of 1917 and ended it in November of 1918. And I said, no, that's not it. Those dates represent when we became involved in World War I and when World War I was over. And so it just crushes me that we don't know that historically, because 2 million Americans fought in that war. So this is just a sampling of the World War I quilts that are now at the museum. And I felt it important to set those quilts in time in the decade, because we were only in the war for 18 months. But there was also, so the quilts that are here, or the details of quilts that are here, are also in the museum. And these are signed and dated quilts from that era also. There was crazy quilt making going on still. There were quilts with thousands of pieces. There were wool quilts. There were signature quilts. There was red work quilts. So this is a quilt that is from Britain. It is composed of alternate silk, those silks that came with cigar silks is what they're usually called. It has been conserved and may need some more conservation, but it is a British piece, and in the center of the Allied flags. The next quilt is the red work quilt, and this is Canadian, and this is also a victory quilt. So it represents two important quilts that were made during the war. The next quilt we have is an amazing piece that just came from the Southern Quilt exhibit and is on its way to your museum. And this is the Emma Hembry quilt of Cumberland City, Tennessee. And what is amazing about this is these letters are about 3 inches tall. They're all pieced. And according to the documentation on the quilt, it was started on May 7th, 1917, and finished on June 21st, 1917. And this is every quilt historian's dream, this documentation. And the poem is actually a hymn, Nearer My God to Thee. And it was a hymn that was sung at the memorials of many Civil War soldiers, and was also sung at the memorials of World War I soldiers. It's just an amazing piece, and I'm so happy that you all have it.
I feel like our museum is set up to preserve these kind of important quilts, so I feel like we can really take good care of it. And I can't even imagine. She must have just worked every day, devoted to this quilt to get it done in really what looks to be like, what, 6-7 weeks?
Yeah.
Wow. It was really important to her to get that piece done.
I know, and unfortunately, so there is a connection, with her to World War I. Her husband, the possibility of her husband serving. So I hope that with further research, we'll be able to nail that down. And then the next quilt that is typical is not typical. This is actually pretty rare. I only know of 2 other museums now that have World War I quilts like this, and they are wool service banners that are actually machine embroidered, and they're embroidered with the Blue Star Service flag that indicates that you have a loved one who has been deployed. So that is a very unusual quilt, and I think there's a close-up in the next slide. There you go.
So who would receive these service banners, or how would they be used?
So the banner was designed during World War I by an Army captain who had a son serving in the war, and it was made like a quilt actually, but it was hung in a window to indicate that you have a loved one deployed. Now here in this version, you can see that it's camouflage wool that the banner is embroidered upon. So I'm not sure what the purpose was, unless they somehow bound these pieces because they're all separate and then hung them. But you've got the infantry and their artillery. And then you'll see silver stars also, and that indicates that you have either been injured in a war or you are missing in action. So that's what the silver star would indicate. And they could be hung in the window of the home of the soldier.
Wow.
The World War I Museum in Kansas City only has 2 or 3 of these. And then there's a museum in Des Plaines, Illinois, and that has one. And then you have the 4th one.
That is so amazing that somebody had, interesting that they had all of those. Maybe they were the person who, or someone was affiliated as the person who, you know, sent those out, and maybe World War I ended and they had leftovers. And I mean, do you have any feeling of why they would have put them all together like this?
So my guess is that someone worked at a factory and then they had these already embroidered, and they didn't, I mean, they created this very historic piece for what it represents, and now they're all together in a quilt, and yeah, and we have them instead of having them thrown away. Or
yeah, I think there certainly was at the time, earlier 20th century, you didn't throw away textiles, you didn't throw away ribbons, you didn't throw anything away that you could find a way to reuse. And this is such a rare and unusual piece. Really interesting.
The next quilt we have is that's World War I based, is the quintessential iconic World War I quilt, the modern Priscilla Red Cross quilt, and this particular one is from Washington County, Ohio. So the blue stars represent soldiers from World War I from that area, and then there are other. It was made as a fundraiser. And the next quilt we have is a poppy quilt, and that pretty much ends the World War I quilts. But these poppy quilts were made after the war, of course, but that was often the only memory that the World War I veterans shared with their family was of the poppy fields. And that's the reason poppies are associated with World War I. So moving on to the World War II, because that collection is on its way, there are a few quilts. You've got the typical, what you would call made for the military. This one is those silks that's embossed, floss embossed block, and it's one block of many that are the same. And you've got the V for victory, the Morse code for V, and then remember Pearl Harbor. And this is only one of 2 quilts that I've seen like this. So that is on its way. And then the next one is the Army Navy E Award quilt. That banner is a superimposed picture on the quilt, but the banner was given to about 3,000 manufacturing companies across the U.S. for excellence in war production. And it was given with a citation ceremony, and they received the banner and then a white star for every year after for excellence in war production. So it would hang outside the company with the American flag. And after the war, she cut the banner but bound the quilt, the flag, to make a quilt so that they would always stay together.
Wow, that is so interesting.
And then the next quilt, is what we would consider the typical, this was made, it was a published pattern during the war. It's either Aunt Martha or Laura Wheeler. This one is dated 1943, and it's a great design. It has been refigured for today's sewers by Fons and Porter, and in their latest issue, you will find a pattern for this quilt.
Wow, I love that pattern. It's so graphic and so bold and really intriguing.
It's almost like an Escher design to me.
It is, it is. And gosh, the amount of research you've done, Sue, and the amount of learning you had to do to really recognize all of these patterns and all of these different textiles that have been incorporated is just astounding.
Well, thank you. And then we have, the next one is, what I call the roll call or the honor roll quilts. And there may be a close-up next, but these are quilts that were made to record the service of your area. So this one is from Newport, Texas, which is in Clay County. And the men's names on this quilt are from Montague County and Clay County. And it's a small rural area even today, but someone took time and embroidered the names of all these men who were serving in the war. Ricky Tim's uncle's name is embroidered on this quilt.
Are you kidding? Wow. And the names that are coming, we see some that are England and some Switzerland. Were these people that maybe these men served with, or did they come to the States afterwards?
No, so the names are men from Clay County and Montague County. Underneath, you see their rank, private, lieutenant, corporal. The place names underneath are where they served in the world.
Wow. What an amazing record of service. That is incredible.
And then the next quilt we have is a victory quilt. And there's so many different variations of victory quilts. This one, it was from Canada, made by Françoise Millette. She spelled victory on the diagonal. And her husband, Dollard, fought in the war, and he did return home. I did purchase this directly from their son, who was selling the quilt.
Wow.
And next we have the fundraising quilts that were made to raise monies for the war effort, for the Red Cross, that sort of thing. And this one is from Kansas and Oklahoma.
Parents of Gold Star boys. That's a really poignant block, particularly.
And then I think the last one we have to show is the other kind of quilts. These are very utilitarian quilts. They were made in abundance. They were sent from Canada and the United States to the Low Countries, to Britain, to the refugees in France. And they are very utilitarian. You'd probably pass them up at a thrift store. But if you look on the corner in the back or the front of these tiny little tags that show that they were made by the American or the Canadian Red Cross, and that is what gives them their historic value.
We actually had someone get in touch with us that had found one in Britain, and it was Bundles for Britain. that I
Yes.
think came out of Canada.
Yes. No, Bundles for Britain, and there's if you look in the World War II book, you'll see a lot of information about that. Bundles for Britain was started by a socialite in New York City, and she rented a storefront, and women would go there and knit for the soldiers, and their motto was a bundle for every bomb.
Oh my
Seriously.
gosh.
And they also made quilts, and their quilts were donated to the Red Cross. So Bundles for Britain was another organization, along with church groups and independent quilters who donated quilts to the Red Cross, and many of them were sent to Europe. Very few of them survived, so the ones that did survive are really special.
Very. So it's I don't remember the details, but we had the Sanitary Commission during the Civil War, and who obviously facilitated a lot of quilt making and getting items to the fronts and to the boys. Did the Red Cross take over from the Sanitary Commission, or how did those two? Were there any relation between those two?
No, not really. The Sanitary, they're two separate entities. I think so. Connecticut's nickname is the Provision State. And up until maybe the Spanish-American War or World War I, towns and communities supplied the soldiers with what they needed. And so the Sanitary Commission would put out lists of things that were needed, and then communities would pack barrels and send them off to the battlefront, directly to the battlefront. As the century progressed and we got to the Spanish-American War and then into World War I, people were still sending things to our soldiers, but it was a little bit more organized, and it wasn't so divided in communities. And there was a tremendous benevolent effort of people volunteering during World War I for the war effort. Those people that are often identified as World War I nurses in the white uniforms, those were actually the uniforms that they would put on to go work in the rooms, the Red Cross rooms, to cut bandages and to pack things to send to the battlefront. And so they weren't always nurses. That was their uniform. And those chapter rooms operated 24 hours a day. It was an incredible benevolent effort on our part. And that extended right through World War II. And then the Korean War is a different story. I have not come across a Korean War quilt yet.
Interesting. And maybe that's partly due to the fact that quilting kind of was on the wane for a while then anyway.
Possibly.
Interesting. Well, and just to bring it up to today, you're on the board of the Quilts of Valor. And so can you tell us a little bit about what the Quilts of Valor are doing today? Because you're kind of carrying on that tradition now.
Yes. I'm very proud to be a member of Quilts of Valor and on the board. It's been an amazing experience. We are closing in on since we began counting, which was not at the very beginning, we are closing in on our 300,000th quilt awarded to a veteran or service member touched by war. So we hope to meet that by either the end of this year or the beginning of next year. And Quilts of Valor is going to be 20 years old in 2023. And we have another book coming out that we were able to write one book, 50 State Salute, for Quilts of Valor. And then members of the quilt community who are celebrities all designed and made quilts, and we're going to have 25 of those in a book that is going to be our next publication for Quilts of Valor. So It's been a very exciting project. Thanks for asking.
That is amazing, Sue. And I just love that we have this long tradition of women doing their part, and obviously women are serving abroad and doing everything in the service now. But how great is it that tradition has carried on and that we're still making quilts and still showing support by making quilts. I just think that's so important.
Absolutely.
And I have we have had a couple of events here with Quilts of Valor. We have our local group meets here, and it is really it is an amazing moment when you see a soldier from whatever war they served in presented with their quilt. It is so meaningful for them to be remembered and to have their service honored that way. It is just an amazing feeling watching that.
Particularly for our Vietnam era veterans. I can't tell you the number of Vietnam era veterans who say to us, I've been home for 50 years and this is the first time anyone has said thank you for your service and welcome home.
Oh, and that is so terrible that has happened. But what a great thing to at least give them that honor at long last. I think that is an amazing group, and I just admire you all so much for what you're doing, and we'll be really looking forward to seeing that new book come out.
Thank you. And we have over 10,000 members across the United States making Quilts of Valor. So they've been quilting up a storm during COVID.
I bet they have, haven't we all? So, before we go, Marilee Grove tells us that she Googled the Golden West quilt pattern and found a site on Etsy where you can get the pattern. You can purchase it and download it. So the pattern, the full pattern, obviously is out there in the ether world.
Good.
So maybe if we can't find one that was made back in the 30s, we can acquire one that was made today. If somebody's going to get busy on that, just putting it out there to all our viewers. If you're thinking you needed to do some embroidery, there's your pattern. We'll have fun. Well, Sue, we're almost to our hour. Is there anything else that you wanted to add? We will be planning on an exhibition of your quilts. I think we've got the World War I quilts coming up soon, and so we'll be able to show those. Can't wait to get the World War II quilts here. You've got them all packed and ready for us to ship them. So as we speak, we'll be getting that done. And we just can't, having a collection like yours that comes with such great provenance is really what we're all about and what we are always looking for. And I think having a person like you who's really spent their life putting these collections together, it's just not something, I don't think we could ever do that ourselves. We could not find the means to be out there and collecting. And so we just are so appreciative of your generosity and your thoughtfulness and really for history, for the future. Like you said, you know, we don't want that information to be lost. We need these things to be preserved, and we're just honored to be able to do that. So thank you so much for those collections, Sue.
I'm very grateful to you that they can stay in a collection, because I think that if they went back into the marketplace, they would lose their historic provenance. And even though when I present, I say, even though these quilts would never be juried into a quilt show, or they're not maybe aesthetically beautiful, their historic component is so important. And I think that sometimes the best way you learn history is through the material object, right? Instead of sitting there reading the book, when you can actually see the item that was created during that time period and you can connect with quilt maker, then it just takes on a whole different meaning.
Obviously, that's the way we learn, Sue, isn't it? We like starting with that object and seeing where that takes us. And it has been an amazing experience, the amount you can learn from doing research on a quilt. So, and that's what AQSG is about. So it's just something that we all love. And I think your collections exemplify it in such a beautiful way. So anyway, so
thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today. So much interesting comments and questions, and we'll look forward to hopefully finding that Golden West quilt in the meantime. And if you have any other questions, you can reach us through Facebook. We'll be back here next week. I don't know. Tara's in the background. I'm going to put you on the spot, Tara. Do you know who we have on store for next week?
For next month?
Or next month. What am I saying? Next week. Next month.
That's fine. Let's see. I can quickly find that for you.
And thank you again, Tara. You always do such a good job on handling all the images and all the work for us.
Thank you, Tara.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry if I jump ahead a little bit sometimes, but so actually next month we have American Quilt Study Group has our annual seminar, and we get to do that live in person this year. Last year we had to do it virtually because of everything else. And we'll be in Harrisonburg, Virginia for that. So we're not doing a QUILTSIDE chat in August, but in September, we are doing one on September 19th with Anita Lascalzo.
We're doing Prussian blue, aren't we? Yes.
I think so. Yeah, she's the Prussian.
She is an expert.
Yeah.
Well, that'll be really fun. So we'll look forward to seeing everybody in September. And in the meantime, enjoy the seminar in Harrisonburg. And thank you so much again for being here. And thank you, Sue and Tara.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you, ladies.
We'll
Thank
see
you,
all
Tara.
soon.
Bye now.
Bye now.
Thanks, everyone.